flickering gaslight cast long, distorted shadows across the cobbled street. Rain lashed down in icy sheets, turning the cobbles slick and treacherous. A lone figure, cloaked and hooded against the relentless storm, hurried along the deserted thoroughfare. He clutched a leather-bound journal tightly to his chest, his knuckles bone white against the damp leather. Jonathan Harker, solicitor by profession, was a man on the edge of a precipice. Just days ago, he had been a man of logic and reason, his life governed by the neat columns of ledgers and the precise language of contracts. Now he was adrift in a sea of terror, his sanity battered by the horrors he had witnessed. Harker's destination was the asylum, a forbidding edifice that loomed at the edge of the town like a stone sentinel. He had been traveling for days, fleeing the nightmare that had consumed him in the heart of Transylvania. He carried with him the only tangible proof of his ordeal, his journal, filled with chilling accounts of the unspeakable being he had encountered. He paused at the imposing iron gates, their bars twisted and gnarled as if clawed by some monstrous beast. A shiver ran down his spine as he pulled the heavy chain that activated the rusted bell. The sound echoed through the night, a mournful clang that seemed to hang in the air, a harbinger of the darkness within. A moment later, a small hatch in the gate creaked open, revealing the face of a wizened old man, his eyes peering suspiciously into the night. "State your business," the man rasped, his voice as brittle as dry leaves. "I seek sanctuary," Harker replied, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "I have information, important information." The old man scrutinized Harker for a long moment, his gaze sharp and piercing. Finally, he grunted and unlatched the gate, allowing Harker to step inside. Harker entered the asylum grounds, the gate clanging shut behind him with a finality that made his heart pound in his chest. The asylum was even more imposing up close, its stone walls rising up like sheer cliffs, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the night. The old man, who introduced himself as Porter, led Harker through a maze of dimly lit corridors. The air was thick with a cloying scent of disinfectant and something else, something Harker couldn't quite place, a primal musk that made his stomach churn. The sounds of madness echoed from the cells that lined the corridor. Moans, shrieks, and deranged laughter, a chorus of the damned that sent chills down Harker's spine. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, afraid of what he might see behind those barred windows. Finally, Porter stopped before a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred with deep scratches and dents. He unlocked the door and ushered Harker inside. "Wait here," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The doctor will see you shortly." Harker was left alone in a sparsely furnished room, lit by a single flickering gas lamp. A desk sat in the corner, piled high with dusty books and papers. A leather examination chair stood in the center of the room, its restraints gleaming ominously in the dim light. Harker sank into a chair, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He pulled his journal from his cloak and began to leaf through the pages, reliving the nightmare he was desperate to escape. It had all begun with a seemingly innocuous business trip to Transylvania. Harker had been tasked with finalizing the purchase of an estate in England for a foreign client, a Count Dracula. From the moment he stepped foot on Transylvanian soil, a sense of unease had settled upon him, a growing feeling that he had ventured into a land where the shadows held ancient and terrible secrets. The Count's castle, perched high atop a windswept crag, was a place of shadows and whispers, a gothic labyrinth that seemed to pulse with a sinister life of its own. The Count himself was an enigma, a figure of chilling charisma and unsettling charm, his eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. As the days turned into weeks, Harker found himself increasingly isolated and alone, trapped in the castle with a being whose true nature was slowly revealing itself. The Count's nocturnal habits, his aversion to sunlight, his unnatural strength and speed, all pointed to a terrifying truth that Harker at first refused to acknowledge. He had dismissed the local legends as mere superstition, tales told to frighten children. But now, as he saw the Count's true face in the mirror, the reflection of a monstrous predator, the legends became horrifyingly real. One night, as the Count was feeding on his blood, Harker had glimpsed the truth in all its hideous glory. The Count, his face contorted in a mask of bestial hunger, his fangs dripping with crimson, was a vampire, a creature of the night that preyed on the living. Harker had managed to escape the castle, his mind reeling with terror, his body weakened from the Count's nightly assaults. He had fled across the vast, desolate landscape, driven by a primal instinct to survive. Now, here he was, seeking refuge in the asylum, the only place he could think of where he might find safety from the monster that hunted him. The door creaked open, and a tall, gaunt figure entered the room. Dr. John Seward, the asylum's director, was a man of science and reason, a staunch believer in the power of logic and observation. But even his clinical facade could not completely mask the flicker of unease that crossed his face as he took in Harker's haggard appearance. "Mr. Harker," Seward said, his voice calm and measured. "Porter tells me you have information of a sensitive nature." Harker nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He pushed his journal across the desk. "Read this," he croaked. "Everything is in there." Seward picked up the journal, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the pages. As he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to concern, then to outright alarm. "This is quite a tale, Mr. Harker," he said, his voice tight. "It's the truth," Harker insisted. "He's real. He's coming here." Seward hesitated for a moment, then closed the journal. "I believe you, Mr. Harker," he said, his voice grave. "But you must understand, these are extraordinary claims. I need more than just your word." Harker's heart sank. He had hoped that his journal, his meticulous record of his ordeal, would be enough to convince Seward of the danger. "What more can I do?" he asked, his voice laced with desperation. "He's coming for me. He won't stop until I'm dead." "Calm yourself, Mr. Harker," Seward said, his tone soothing. "We will get to the bottom of this. But for now, you must rest. You're clearly exhausted." Seward rang a bell, and Porter entered the room. "Take Mr. Harker to a room," Seward instructed. "Make sure he's comfortable." Porter led Harker out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the silent corridor. As they passed the barred cells, Harker heard the inmates stirring, their moans and whispers rising in intensity, as if sensing the darkness that had entered the asylum. Harker was shown to a small, Spartan room, its only furniture a narrow bed and a rickety chair. A single barred window, high up on the wall, offered a glimpse of the storm-ravaged night sky. He collapsed onto the bed, his body and mind utterly spent. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windowpane, sent a jolt of fear through him. He knew that Dracula was coming for him. He had seen the hunger in the vampire's eyes, the unyielding determination to claim him as his own. As the night wore on, Harker's fear grew. He felt trapped, a prisoner in his own mind, haunted by the memories of the horrors he had witnessed. He rose from the bed and paced the small room, his restless energy a reflection of his mounting terror. He glanced at the barred window, the only escape route from the asylum. He knew it was futile. Dracula's powers were beyond anything he could comprehend. The vampire could move with unnatural speed and silence, could scale walls and slip through the smallest of openings. No earthly barrier could hold him back. Still, Harker felt a desperate urge to do something, anything, to reclaim some semblance of control over his fate. He grabbed the chair and smashed it against the window, the wood splintering under the force of the blow. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the asylum, a jarring note in the symphony of madness that filled the night. A moment later, Harker heard footsteps approaching his room, heavy and deliberate. He knew who it was. The door swung open, revealing the imposing figure of Dr. Seward, his face pale and drawn. "What's the meaning of this, Mr. Harker?" Seward demanded, his voice sharp. "Why are you destroying asylum property?" "He's here," Harker gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I know he is." Seward's gaze fell upon the broken window. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the shadows, as if searching for some unseen presence. "There's no one here, Mr. Harker," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're letting your imagination run away with you." Harker shook his head. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "He's not like us. He's different." A sudden gust of wind rattled the bars of the window, and the gas lamp flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. Seward took a step back, his eyes widening slightly. "What was that?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. A low growl, guttural and menacing, echoed from the corridor outside the room. Harker's blood ran cold. "He's found me," he whispered. Seward turned toward the door, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Who's found you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The growl grew louder, closer, vibrating through the floorboards, shaking the very foundations of the asylum. The door burst open, splintering into 1,000 pieces, and a dark shape lunged into the room. Harker screamed. It was Dracula, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory fire, his fangs bared in a cruel snarl. "Jonathan," Dracula hissed, his voice a seductive whisper that sent shivers down Harker's spine. "I've come for you, my dear." Seward stumbled back, his face contorted in a mask of terror. What is that?" he stammered, his voice choked with fear. Dracula turned his burning gaze upon Seward, his expression one of contempt. "You are nothing to me," he sneered. "A mere insect to be crushed underfoot." Dracula lunged at Seward, his fangs glinting in the dim light. Seward screamed and raised his hands to protect himself. But Dracula's attack was swift and merciless. His fangs sank into Seward's throat, and the doctor's scream was cut short in a gurgling gasp. Seward slumped to the floor, his lifeblood staining the asylum floor crimson. Dracula turned his attention back to Harker, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Now, Jonathan," he purred, his voice a symphony of darkness and desire. "We can be together, forever." Harker shrank back, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and revulsion. He knew what Dracula wanted. He had seen the hunger in the vampire's eyes, the insatiable desire to possess him, body and soul. "No," Harker whispered, his voice weak but resolute. "I won't let you." Dracula's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You have no choice," he snarled. "You are mine. You will be mine." Dracula advanced on Harker, his movements smooth and predatory, like a panther stalking its prey. Harker scrambled back, his eyes darting about the room, searching for a weapon, any means of defense. His gaze fell upon the shard of broken glass from the window, lying glinting on the floor. He lunged for it, his fingers closing around the jagged edge. Dracula laughed, a sound that echoed through the asylum like the tolling of a death knell. "Foolish mortal," he mocked. "Do you think a piece of glass can harm me?" But Harker was desperate. He knew this was his last chance, his only hope of survival. He raised the shard of glass, holding it before him like a crucifix warding off a demon. "Stay back," he hissed, his voice rasping with fear. "Don't come any closer." Dracula's eyes narrowed. He paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "You would defy me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "I have nothing left to lose," Harker replied, his voice surprisingly steady. He lunged at Dracula, the shard of glass flashing in the dim light. Dracula recoiled, a look of surprise and anger twisting his features. He raised his hand to ward off the attack, but Harker's blow was true. The shard of glass sliced through Dracula's flesh, drawing a thin line of blood across the vampire's pale skin. Dracula roared in pain and fury, his eyes blazing with rage. "You dare!" he shrieked, his voice echoing through the asylum, a sound of pure, primal rage. He lunged at Harker, his fangs bared, his eyes burning with murderous intent. But something was different. Dracula's movements were sluggish, his strength waning. The wound on his hand, though small, was bleeding profusely, the crimson stain spreading across his pale skin like a spreading blight. Harker stared in disbelief. The legends were true. A vampire could be wounded, even killed, by a mortal hand. Dracula stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning fear. What have you done?" he gasped, his voice weak and raspy. Harker's grip on the shard of glass tightened. He knew what he had to do. He lunged again, driving the shard of glass deep into Dracula's chest, piercing the vampire's heart. Dracula screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the asylum. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, he collapsed to the floor, his body dissolving into dust, leaving behind only a pile of ashes and the lingering scent of decay. Harker stood over the remains of his tormentor, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He had won. He had survived. But the victory was bittersweet. He had escaped the clutches of a monster, but he knew that the horrors he had witnessed would haunt him forever. He glanced at the body of Dr. Seward, lying lifeless on the asylum floor. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing that he had brought this darkness upon the asylum, had condemned the innocent to a gruesome fate. He knew that he could not stay here. He could not bear to face the consequences of his actions. He fled the asylum, leaving behind the carnage and the madness, running into the storm-ravaged night, a solitary figure haunted by the memories of the horrors he had witnessed. Harker's tale is just one of many that whisper through the shadows, a chilling reminder that the world is a darker place than we often care to admit. For in the hidden corners, in the forgotten places, the monsters lurk, waiting for their moment to emerge, to prey on the unsuspecting, to feed on our fear. And sometimes, when the night is darkest and the shadows longest, the monsters find us.